In English, many surnames come from the professions of their ancestors. These are called occupational surnames. Examples include Smith, a blacksmith, Miller, a miller, Tailor, a tailor, and Carpenter, and so on. In this episode, you'll learn some of the more common ones and we'll explain the vocabulary related to the profession. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hi, I'm Reza.
And my name's Craig Wheeland.
And with nearly... you threw me off there. We never use our surnames, but it's very appropriate today. With nearly 60 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you, my friend?
I'm very, very well, thank you. I'm fantastic. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. I really like the fact that you used your surname there. I didn't want to use mine because I could have, but I thought mine isn't a profession. And yours, well, we'll talk about yours later. And besides, mine isn't even English because remember, my father was born in India. So I have got a surname which is fairly common there. Well, come to think of it, it's become fairly common in the United Kingdom as well. But it isn't actually a profession. But we'll talk about Craig's later. It's a good one.
Okay. First, though, we want to start this week with a voice message from a friend of the show, Luis from Mexico City.
Hi, Risa. Hi, Craig. This is Luis from Mexico City. I'd like to talk about the podcast when you talked about AI applications and websites for the speaking practice. And I'm amazed about the things you have showed us. The audios from Sesame, it really sounds very natural. It's like you were talking to a real person. It reminded me the film called Her with Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson. I don't know if you remember it. Well, I use Practica, and I've used another couple of applications and tried them, but I use, for now, Practica. And it is something that is useful, but it isn't so natural, so I don't think I'm going to use it for a long time. It has a button to send your voice message. It misunderstands some words and vowels, so I'm going to use it for a while. But I think that Copilot could be a better option for me, so I'm going to try it soon. See you later. Have a nice day. Thank you for all you do for us.
Thanks very much for your message, Luis. That was very clear and a very nice message. And I agree with you. What a great episode of the podcast. I wasn't involved in that.
That's why it was so good.
That's why it was so good, exactly. But I learned a hell of a lot from it. I listened to it and I learned a lot. I was really interested in the results that Craig got from his experimentation with different AI apps, and I'm interested in yours as well. I hadn't heard of that Practica, but I'll look out for it. Over to you, Craig, because you're the expert in this. I'm out of my depth here.
Have you seen the film Her that Luis mentioned with Joaquin Phoenix?
I have. I really enjoyed it.
It was good, wasn't it?
It was a good film.
Very, very well recommended. I'll put a link in the show notes so that you can go and have a look at the trailer for that film. And the episode that Luis referred to was inglespodcast.com/564, episode 564, how to use AI as an English conversation partner. And I did take a look at the one that Luis recommended, or the one he's using now, which is Practica. It seems to be aimed at Spanish speakers, which might be good if you need some extra language support and help with Spanish, especially in the interface of the platform. Although I would definitely recommend Copilot by Microsoft. That for me is the one to go to if you want to practice. It sounds very natural, and I actually enjoy talking to my Copilot AI from time to time. He's a very nice guy. So, Reza, let's go to the main focus of today's podcast, surnames. Your second name. Surnames derived from occupations. Now, the first one I think is possibly the most common surname for British people. Would you agree with that?
I'm fairly sure it's the most common surname in the English language in the world. Whether you're talking about America, Canada, Australia, Ireland, it doesn't really matter. I think Smith tends to be the number one. It's hardly surprising that it's a very common surname because it was such an important job. A smith was, and still is, to use the full term, a blacksmith is and was a person who worked with iron. Things like horseshoes in the past. Well, and in the present, I don't know why I'm talking about the past. In the present, horseshoes still have to be made. So you need a blacksmith for that. Someone who can heat the metal, hammer it, bend it into shapes. A very important job.
Yeah, horseshoes. Not so common now as before, but they still make horseshoes. A miller is another occupation that is slowly disappearing. So it's obviously a surname, Miller. And that's a person who worked in a mill or works in a mill grinding grain. So you need flour to make bread. And the way to obtain flour, to get flour, is to grind or make very small by rubbing on a stone that turns around. And then you grind the grain to a very fine powder almost. And then you have flour.
Interestingly, both those surnames are almost identical in German language. Smith is Schmidt and Miller is Miller. And they're both really common surnames in the top 4 or 5 in German language as well. Schmidt and Miller, Smith and Miller. And Miller, not in Spanish, but Smith, of course, is either Herrera or Herrero, masculine, feminine, or the Catalan Valencian version, Ferrer. All of those are Smith, and it's very, very common in Spanish as well.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Our next one is also a common occupation and a common surname, tailor, Taylor. What's a tailor, Reza?
Well, if it's the profession, we have to spell it Tailor, whereas Craig said it was a Y when it's a surname usually. So the profession is usually a man, or in the past it was always men. Perhaps there are female tailors these days, but it was a man who made clothes for men. He measured men, he took their measurements, their chest size, their inside leg, their waist, etc. And then he made the clothes. So if you want a nice suit, a really good suit, rather than buying one off the peg, that means already made, you go to a tailor and he'll make one specifically to measure for you.
So if it's made by a tailor, you can use the adjective it's tailor-made, and that's often used for other things apart from clothes. For example, you can have a tailor-made English course, which is where the course is specifically designed and written for you and your needs. Tailor-made can be used as a way to describe anything that is adapted to what you need individually. So it's a very individual thing.
The next name is a very important profession, and there are still plenty around today. That's carpenter.
I can't find a good one. I'm looking for a good carpenter in Valencia.
Oh, yeah. A
Not
good one,
easy.
not easy.
Not
A
easy.
bad one, yes, but a good one, that's a different story. Yeah, there are carpenters, but not many are good. So a carpenter is a person who works. In the past, they worked, but there's still some around today, and they work with wood, building and repairing structures. So they make things from scratch, that means from zero, but they also repair things which have already been made if they're made of wood. So obviously a lot of things are made of wood. It's still one of the chief principal materials of everyday life. So carpenter is a very important profession.
And if you know a carpenter in Valencia who does do tailor-made work, designing cupboard doors and similar things so that we don't need to buy a whole new kitchen, then please let me know. Our next one is Fisher, Fisher. By the way, you can see all of these surnames and the notes written in the show notes at inglespodcast.com/577. So a person who caught fish was called a fisherman, still is called a fisherman. And at school I knew a fisher, Paul Fisher. A bit of a slippery character he was.
Very apt that he was slippery.
Very slippery, not to be trusted.
When I think of the surname Fisher, I always think of a person who really I spent very few hours, maybe minutes of my life with, but Herr Fischer in Berlin. It's a very common surname there as well. But this was a really strange mix because Herr Fischer, and it's a very common German surname, was Ukrainian, just to add a bit of confusion. Many, many, many years ago when I was very young, I worked in Berlin selling newspapers on the street. Newspapers, yeah, made out of paper, not online, yes, on the street. And I had to travel with my English colleague, Jeremy, to an S-Bahn station in Berlin where Herr Fischer, the Ukrainian coordinator, but he was a German Ukrainian. That's when I discovered that there is such a thing as a German Ukrainian, quite a few. He gave us the newspapers. And so I was like, oh, Herr Fischer, guten Morgen. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. A bit of chat. Oh, the English, yeah. And we had a bit of a chat and we went on our way and sold the newspapers. So that was the first Herr Fischer, the German Fischer I met. But it's a very common name in English, just as it is in German.
And you don't know if he was a fisherman or whether he just sold newspapers.
Well, he was a newspaper seller like us, but I'm sure in the past, one of his ancestors caught fish.
Another very common English surname is Baker, Baker, and you probably know that a baker bakes bread and other lovely things like cakes and buns and lovely things. So a baker, a person, that's the profession, a person who bakes.
Add just one letter to baker, an R, and you've got a barker, Barker. So a barker was a person who worked with leather and animal hides. Not a person who barked. Only crazy people bark. Dogs bark, but normally people don't. A person who barks is called a weirdo, a wacko, a fruit nut, but not a barker. A barker worked with leather and animal hides. That's the skin from an animal. And they prepared these leather hides for things like sandals, belts, shoes, etc. That was the work of a barker, which is still a very common surname today.
Not maybe a common profession, though, would you say?
No, as a profession, no, but as a surname, it's still, yeah.
Our next surname, Cooper, is another profession that is dying out. If you say something is dying out, that phrasal verb means it's slowly disappearing. A Cooper is a person who makes barrels. Imagine you go to a place where they're making or brewing beer or making whiskey or brandy. You would probably see in the factory, in the place, you'd see barrels, big, tall, wide containers made of wood, and you keep the alcohol and the liquid inside. So a barrel is what a cooper makes, and I think they have metal around them, don't they, to keep them strong and to stop them deforming and going out of shape. So the cooper was the person who would put the metal hoops and make these barrels, also called a cask sometimes, C-A-S-K. I think a cask will be more used in the industry. So if you're making brandy or wine or something similar, you'd probably use the word cask. But a more common word for everyday use is barrel. And we also call someone a barrel of laughs if they're good company. And if you scrape the barrel, then you're using the last thing that remains of something. So imagine that you don't have very good whiskey at home and you take out, Reza wants to drink a whiskey and you take out the cheap supermarket whiskey. Reza might say, oh, you're really scraping the barrel with that whiskey. That's terrible. So it's the worst thing, the last thing that's left. Let's take a quick break here because I know you listen to this podcast to take your English to the next level. But what about your speaking? Is your fluency improving? Are you happy with your speaking skills? My conversation course focuses on making you a more confident and more fluent English speaker. You'll join me and a small group of motivated students, and we'll meet on Zoom and have topical discussions, role plays, debates, and presentations that will expand your vocabulary and help you express yourself effectively in English. So be proactive and take the first step towards becoming a confident and fluent English speaker. Send me an email today to craig@inglespodcast.com and I'll send you details of the next online conversation course. Thanks for listening. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Well, if I said the word to you night, you would probably think, is that the word that's the opposite of day? Well, it could be, but that isn't a common surname. We would have to add the letter K. K, N-I-G-H-T. That is a fairly common surname. And you might also know that it refers to what used to be a job. A knight was a mounted soldier. So mounted means mounted on a horse in medieval Europe, and they served a king or a lord in exchange for land or honor. So they served the king, and the king said, you are a knight. Yes, you officially work for me, a great honor. And it was often connected with a code of chivalry. So if you were a knight, you were expected to have very high standards of how you conduct yourself, to be a gentleman, to treat ladies well, to be very chivalrous. And it emphasized bravery, loyalty, and honor. And even today, in fact, to be knighted, that means to become a knight, it means that you've been given the title of Sir, if you're a man, and it could be for a lady. In that case, you would be Dame. For example, think of Sir Paul McCartney of the Beatles, Dame Judi Dench, the very famous actress. They have given great services to the United Kingdom. So as a way of saying thank you, the Queen at that time knighted them. They said, you can officially call yourself Sir, or for a lady, Dame, because of the honourable service you have given to the United Kingdom and by extension, the royal family. So people still get knighted today, and it can be a surname.
Once a king, always a king.
But once a knight's enough.
Aha.
That's an old one.
That's an old one. Did you notice who's been knighted this year?
No.
David Beckham is
that's
now
right. Yeah, I heard it.
Sir David Beckham.
Yeah, I heard that.
Gary Oldman, the actor,
Oh, I didn't know that.
one of my favourite actors. And Roger Daltrey from one of my favourite bands, The Who, is
Really?
now Sir Roger Daltrey.
I like The Who as well. I didn't know he'd been knighted. Well, that's good news.
Who are you?
Yeah.
Our next surname is Wright, but with a W. W-R-I-G-H-T. And that's a person who was a maker or repairer of things. Now, I don't think we use that these days as a profession, but it used to be somebody who repaired things, and maybe you could say put things right, perhaps.
Yeah. We do still have the profession of playwright, but that is not a surname. So put the word play before write, and you're talking Shakespeare as the most famous playwright, but people still write theatre today.
And it's spelled like that, isn't it? It's not
Yes.
spelled W-R-I-T-E.
It's curious, isn't it? Because they write, and the verb to write with a pen or on a computer these days is W-R-I-T-E. But for some reason, we've kept the spelling W-R-I-G-H-T for a person who writes theatre. It's curious. It's a playwright spelled that way.
Or maybe who makes the play better, who makes it right, perhaps.
Maybe that's where it comes from.
Now, Reza, I'm sure people have heard of our next surname, Thatcher. Think of Margaret Thatcher, very famous surname there. But what is or was a Thatcher, and do they still exist?
There's a few of them around, but not many. It was a person who was very important in England a few centuries ago and other countries, who made and repaired thatched roofs. So what does thatched mean? It means made of straw. Most roofs these days are made of more solid, more waterproof material. But in the past, they didn't have those. So believe it or not, they used straw in most rural buildings in Britain and Ireland a few centuries ago. So it was a very important job to be able to make and fix those. And that was the work of a thatcher.
Actually, my grandfather was a thatcher.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, Grandad, if you're up there.
Oh, very good. Very good.
Couldn't resist. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Harry Potter. Potter is obviously a surname, Harry Potter. And a potter, Potter, is someone who made things from clay, such as pots, for example. So a potter, someone who works with clay, ceramics, containers, makes containers for water, for example, or wine. That's a potter.
Another word you'll know because of the profession is a gardener. And if it's a profession, we would spell it Garden-ER. So the word garden plus ER. But there's other ways of spelling it as a surname. You can have a look in the show notes. There's 3 ways that I can think of. Obviously, as I've just said, it was a person who in the past and still today tended gardens, looks after gardens. And there are quite a few people with the surname Gardener.
Our next surname is Turner, Turner. You may notice in that word turn in a circle, for example, and that was a person who operated anything that was a revolving machine, any machine that turned around, like a lathe, for example. Lathe is spelled Lathe, and it's a machine that turns around very precisely, and it will cut metal or shape metal for you. So a turner used to be a person who operated a lathe, or maybe still does. I think that profession is still around, although very quickly it's being taken over by machines. So yeah, that's a turner, person who operated a lathe or a revolving machine. Just think of Tina Turner turning around on stage.
Now, the next surname refers to a profession which has virtually completely disappeared now. That's a Fletcher. That was an archer, someone who used a bow and arrow, or someone who made the arrows. So the arrows are the long stick with the sharp bit at the end, which fly through the air. So it's funny because it makes me think of the Spanish word for arrow, which is flecha.
Yeah,
Fletcher,
exactly.
Fletcher. But the English word is arrow. But strangely, the profession's called a Fletcher. There must be a connection.
There must be
somewhere.
a connection, yeah. You've hit the target with that one. The next one is Carter, Carter. There was a famous US president back in the 70s, I think, Jimmy Carter. And I'm sure that Jimmy Carter was not a person who pushed things around in a cart. But that's the meaning of his surname, a person who carted or transported goods, food perhaps, or anything in a cart. Horse and cart, but maybe it was a man who pushed the cart to move things from one place to another.
Didn't Jimmy Carter die recently? We're recording this in June 2025. He lived to quite an age, nearly 100, I think.
Yeah.
In my opinion, just a personal opinion, one of the best presidents the United States has ever had. Very good president, I think. Sadly missed.
Also one of the shortest. It's very unusual for someone of his height to be elected. Normally people vote the taller candidate. But I was just listening to a podcast this morning, actually. He was 5'9.5", and there's only been 2 presidents that were under 5'10".
What? And 5'10" already is tall. Yeah. So they don't like short. You've got to be tall to be US president.
You've got to be tall. That's my advice. If you want to win a general election in the US, you've got to be male, white, and tall.
The next word may be a new word for some of you, and I bet there's even a few younger native English speakers who don't know this word. Chandler. Chandler. It's a surname. That's why we mention it on this episode. But it referred in the past to someone who made candles. So Chandler, candle, sounds a bit similar, doesn't it, to the word candle? I imagine these days 99.9% of candles are made by machines, I would say.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's any connection between the surname Wax and Candles because we've got Ruby Wax, and I know that Waxman is a very common surname. So maybe because candles are made of wax, maybe there's some kind of connection. I'm not sure. Our next one is connected to birds, like chickens, geese, hens, and it's Fowler because the collective name for birds that we eat and get eggs from and that we cultivate for food, we call them fowl, F-O-W-L. So a fowler is someone who used to catch birds so that they could be kept or eaten. Mr. Fowler, Mrs. Fowler.
Now, the next surname is spelled B-R-E-W-E-R, a brewer. A brewer was a person, still is, a person who brews beer. So to brew is to make beer or other alcoholic drinks. Curiously, though, I know that the Spanish word you say destilar, which sounds like the English word distill. But we brew beer, but we distill, for example, whiskey. So the stronger drinks, we distill them. But the weaker drinks, we brew them.
It's a different process.
Different process and different words. But curiously, it's the same word in Spanish. You don't distinguish, but in English we do. We don't have a surname distiller. It is an occupation, but it's not a surname.
There's Ben Stiller, but I don't think that's
he's not Ben Distiller.
Distiller.
I wonder. There might be a connection. though. There might be, but certainly brewer is a surname, and it's also a profession.
Now, Reza's going to pronounce the next surname because it comes from French. What is it, Reza?
Well, the English way, I would say Chamberlain.
Chamberlain, yeah. A chambellan.
Is it? I don't. Yeah, something like
Chamberlain, a person who has a position, a very respected and high position in a royal household or any kind of large estate for people in higher society. So a chamberlain would be responsible for the upkeep or the care of the household, all the people that work in the household, but quite a close, strong connection with the actual king or queen or prince or duke or duchess or whoever lives in this big estate. Then they would be helping with the day-to-day running of the place.
Doesn't the monarch of the United Kingdom still have a chamberlain? Don't they call him the Lord Chamberlain?
Exactly. Yeah. They still exist. Yeah.
The next profession is one which certainly does exist, although it's disappearing in Western countries. There aren't as many as they used to be, and that is shepherds, people who look after sheep. So notice that the animal is spelled S-H-E-E-P, sheep, and it's the same for the singular and the plural, as you probably know, one sheep, two sheep. But if you talk about the person who looks after them, one of the E's disappears, and it's S-H-E-P-H-E-R-D. So one of the E's has disappeared there. A shepherd looks after sheep, and it's a very common surname.
The next profession and surname I had heard of, but I wasn't exactly sure what the job entails, which means what they actually do. So a sexton is nothing to do with sex, S-E-X-T-O-N. A sexton has a lot to do with a church because a sexton is kind of an officer of a church. And I wasn't sure exactly what the roles of this person includes, but apparently they have to maintain the church, which means they're responsible for cleaning, keeping it clean, ringing the bell if the church has a bell, preparing the church for religious services, and also in charge of the cemetery where people are buried and put when they die. So a sexton would be responsible for getting the graves dug. To dig a grave is to make a hole so that you can put a dead person inside. They also care for the headstones where the names of the dead people are written, and just oversee the church property and security to make sure that it's safe for people and that it's being well looked after. So that's a sexton, and it's also a surname.
Our next surname, which was also and still is a profession, is a ward, W-A-R-D. A ward is a guardian or protector. And you still hear it used, for example, In the legal profession, they talk about a ward of court. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah.
A ward of court, that means someone that will be under the protection of the court. It's for children who don't have living parents to look after them. So it's to do with protection. So ward can also be used in a very common phrasal verb to ward off. So we add the preposition off to make it a phrasal verb. And you ward off, that means you prevent something unpleasant or dangerous from happening. It's to protect yourself against something. For example, thinking of things like Dracula, she wore garlic to ward off evil spirits. In the horror films, they always have garlic around the house so Dracula doesn't come in. So the garlic is to ward off the evil spirit.
Our next surname is quite common as a surname, although I'm not sure if the profession still exists. See what Reza thinks in a second. But a Stewart, Stewart, is the name of a person who used to be in charge of a noble household. So again, high society, these big houses in the English countryside, they were responsible for the money. So they were kind of the bookkeepers or the accountants of this big estate, which included the land, all the people living on the land, the buildings, the cattle, the cows, the horses, etc. That's Stewart. And of course, a very common surname. You've got Rod Stewart. You've got Jackie Stewart, the famous racing driver. You've got James Stewart, the actor.
Jon Stewart, the comedian.
Jon Stewart. Mary Stewart was a queen, wasn't she?
Yep, a very common surname in Scotland where Mary Stewart was from.
Do you think it still exists, that profession?
I know it does in a way. I checked on internet. I had a theory and I've checked on internet, and yes. The reason I put it after ward is because it's connected to ward. It's not a coincidence. So one thing is ward, another thing is Stewart, or as it may have been said at one time, steward.
Ah, right. That's interesting. Yeah. Steward.
So Stewart, steward, wart with a T here, but it once was a D. So originally it meant the ward, the person who protected, a word which may have been pronounced something like stee or something like that, which meant the house. So the protector of the house. So it's connected to the word ward. And yes, an air steward. Stewardesses, perhaps, but the male version of a stewardess is a steward.
Yeah.
And what do? They look after things. They make sure that things run smoothly. So in a way, there are still stewards. There's air stewards, people who make sure that the flight is going as it should. So,
although these days, I think the politically correct expression is flight attendant because it doesn't specify the sex.
Yeah.
But yeah, a steward on a boat. Very popular, a steward on a boat.
Yeah. To steward people, it's a verb.
Yeah.
If you steward people, what are you doing? You're making sure that everything's running smoothly. You're doing the work that a steward all those centuries ago would have done for the household.
Good point. The next one is Webster. Actually, it's the last one on the list that we have here. Webster, W-E-B-S-T-E-R. You might notice the first three letters there, web, as in spider's web or the World Wide Web. And it's someone who wove cloth on a loom. Let me explain. So to weave is the verb, W-E-A-V-E, which is to mix the cloth together so that it becomes something, like something you can wear or something you could sleep with, like a blanket. And the loom is the machine on which you do it. So if you've ever seen in films, or if you've been lucky enough to travel and see people working on a loom, they're using their hands, they're using their feet, it's moving, it's going backwards and forwards. You can see the textile, the wool or whatever material they're using, which eventually becomes a sweater or a blanket or an item of clothing. So a Webster, someone who wove cloth on a loom. The past of weave is wove.
Funnily enough, my grandfather worked as a Webster for a short time when he was young. He worked in a factory where they wove linen. So for a short time, he did work with a loom. I suppose I could say he was a Webster for a while, but on an industrial scale. Yeah, I guess when we think of the word Webster, we're thinking of a few centuries ago, what we would call a cottage industry, working from home. Yeah, not so much a factory. Craig said they were the last on the list, but not so. I've taken the liberty of adding a couple more surnames from our family.
Oh, interesting.
I hope you don't mind.
Not at all. Go ahead.
Well, better if you tell them about yours first.
My surname's Wieland, which is fairly unusual. I remember back in the day when I was young, we had a phone book, which was a really thick book with all the names, all the surnames of the people in our local area. And it was huge. And I used to look at my surname, and I was the only Wieland in the book. There were pages and pages of Smiths and Joneses and Stewarts, but only one Wieland. So I realised then that it was a very unusual name. And I think you've done a bit of digging, Reza. You've got some history for me, haven't you? What did you learn?
Well, I learned that there's at least 4, maybe 5 or 6 variations of the spelling. So if you were a Wieland, could come from the same origins as Welland. Take away the A, and it can be with one L or double L. So Wieland or Welland, or even Wayland, which could be W-E-Y, or even W-A-Y-L-A-N-D. Apparently all of them are from the same origins. And according to the information I got, it originally meant the dweller. Think of wheel and think of what it looks like. It looks a bit like the word dwell. You've got the W-E-L there, dwell. Mm-hmm. Wheel, dwell. Yeah. If we take away the D, you've got well. Add the D, you've got dwell. To dwell means to live in a place. So it was the dweller, the person who lived in, the springland. So we land. So the person who lived in the springland, the area where there was a spring.
Oh, interesting. I really like that, actually. It's much kinder than what they used to tell me at school, because they used to say, Wieland, the land where they do wheeze. Because a wee...
Not a very nice type of spring, that.
That's also springing, isn't it? But a wee is a slang word for urinating. That's how kind children can be when they're young.
Well, I guess it's a type of spring, just a very yellow kind of spring.
A yellow river.
Not as transparent as I had.
Moving on, we've also got something from your family. Tell us about Burgess.
Yes, the reason I've written that is because it's the only one I could get that I know of which was a profession. So my surname's Shah, which isn't a typical English profession. My mother's maiden name, that means the surname of a woman before she got married and changed it in English-speaking countries. I know you don't do that in some countries, like Spanish-speaking countries.
In Spain, they keep the surname, don't they?
They keep the father and
the mother.
So when you get married, you don't change your name at all. And the kids take one of each, the mother and the father, but the woman doesn't change her name, which I think is a much better system myself.
Yeah, but it makes the name so long.
Oh, that's true.
It's really difficult to fill in a form.
Yes, that's true.
So the names are so long.
Well, my mother's maiden name wasn't a profession. It's Hull, which is not a profession. But her mother, in other words, my grandmother's surname before she got married was Burgess, B-U-R-G-E-S-S. And it means, it's quite similar to Craig's, actually. It's about dwelling. It's about living in a place. So we share this in common. It referred to the inhabitant, but not of the springland, the inhabitant of a fortified town, a burg, like Edinburgh, or as they perhaps said many years ago, maybe they pronounced it Edinburgh. And American tourists still do. but British people prefer to pronounce it Edinburgh. So in a place like Edinburgh, for example...
Middlesbrough.
Middlesbrough, yeah. Bra in English places. Burr in B-U-R-G-H in Scotland. So a Burgess, someone who lived there. And I can actually think of a famous Burgess, Anthony Burgess, the writer.
Oh, yes, he's very famous.
Yeah, A Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, exactly.
For example. Don't know if he's any relation. I hope he is, and he has passed his literary skills on to me, but I doubt it.
Well, he's definitely passed his podcasting skills on to you. But now it's your turn to practice your English. Do you have similar connections between professions and surnames in your language? If you do, we would love to hear about them. Why don't you send us a voice message and tell us? You can do that by going to speakpipe.com. That's speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. Emails, Reza?
If you prefer to write, you can write to either craig@inglespodcast.com or belfastreza@gmail.com.
And if you're a Spanish speaker and you want to improve your English with free and paid resources, visit the Mansion Inglés website at mansioningles.com. And for paid products, you can browse the online store at store.mansioningles.net.
As always, we'd like to say thanks to all of our Patreon supporters. And when people join the Patreon program by donating a small amount of money, you get, as a way of saying thank you, instant access to the audio transcriptions of this podcast, and as a little added bonus, live Zoom chats with Craig so that you can practice your speaking. If you might be interested in joining the program, there's a link in the show notes. It's patreon.com/InglesPodcast.
And unfortunately, we don't have time to mention all of our lovely podcast sponsors, but we will say hello and welcome to the most recent ones. And lately, Patreon supporters who have joined our program include Danny Push, Marsha Da Rocha. Hi, Marsha. Lovely to speak to you yesterday. Juan and Pipo. Good to hear from you as well, people. Hope to see you again soon. So thank you to you four lovely people and everyone who is supporting us on Patreon.
Craig, what are we going to talk about in next week's episode?
Well, I can't remember if we have spoken about this topic before, but I couldn't find it anywhere, so we're going to do it, and if we have, then we'll just repeat it again. It's superstitions. Superstitions that bring good luck and superstitions that may bring bad luck. So everything to do with the vocabulary of superstitions next week. Please join us for that. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Until next time, it's goodbye from Reza.
And it's goodbye from Craig.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.